The Kansas winter was always cruel, but it was the kind of cruelty that came with routine. Snow piled along the edges of the driveway, a wind sharp enough to cut through denim skies that lingered in shades of gray, as if the sun had forgotten the town entirely. In Wichita, time slowed down during the cold months. The town seemed to shrink into itself, streets quieter, people staying in, even the dogs reluctant to bark at passing cars. For William Bill Carter, that silence was not a burden. It was a kind of camouflage. At 68, Bill had become a part of the wallpaper of the town. People knew him in passing at the grocery store every Tuesday or leaning over the hardware bins at Miller's Supply, but they did not know him. They waved, nodded, called him Mr. Carter out of politeness, and then moved on. He preferred it that way. After a war, after fire, after too many nights of staring into the darkness and feeling it stare back, the anonymity of small-town America was a gift. Every morning began the same. Coffee poured into the same chipped mug, the old wooden chair at the kitchen table creaking under his weight, the refrigerator humming like an old soldier refusing to retire. The window over the sink framed the frost-laced backyard where the garden Helen once tended now lay buried under ice. Sometimes she hummed old hymns as she moved about the kitchen, her hands busy with laundry or bread dough. He recognized the hums. They came when she was worried, when she was trying to keep her own fear quiet. That morning she paused behind him, the basket of folded towels balanced on her hip. "Bill," she said softly, "what's that on your back?" He turned slightly startled. "What do you mean?" Her eyes narrowed, focused. She leaned closer. "On your left shoulder blade. It looks swollen." A muscle tightened in his jaw. Probably nothing, just scar tissue acting up in the cold. But the look on her face unsettled him. Helen was not easily alarmed. For 40 years, she had lived beside his scars, the waxy map of melted skin that stretched from his shoulder down his side. She had washed them, bandaged them when they cracked, pressed her fingers against them when nightmares pulled him awake. She knew his body as well as her own. And still, she said nothing more. She folded the last towel with precise movements, set the basket down, and left the room. He wanted that to be the end of it. But the next morning, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, steam from the shower fogging the edges, he twisted slightly and caught sight of it. The scar on his back, the thick, plasticky flesh that had always seemed foreign, had changed. A mound had risen beneath it, dark purple. The skin stretched taut as if something beneath was pushing to get out. It pulsed faintly like a hidden heart. When he touched it, a dull ache shot down his ribs. He wrapped the towel around his waist and stared at his reflection. 68 years old. A beard salted with gray shoulders bent by time, but the eyes unchanged. Those were the same eyes that had stared into another mirror in 1972, fresh back from Vietnam, skin raw from Graf's body patched together by surgeons who called him lucky. Lucky, they had said to have survived napalm. Lucky to have walked away when others didn't. But he had never felt lucky. He had felt incomplete. Helen said nothing that day, nor the next. They moved around each other quietly like two people circling a sleeping animal, unwilling to disturb it. Bill kept to his routines, stacking firewood, fixing a loose hinge in the garage, driving into town for groceries, but the ache in his back followed him everywhere. At night, lying beside Helen, he traced the swelling absent-mindedly, his fingers trembling against the heat radiating from it. Fear returned creeping back like a long-forgotten comrade. In Wichita, men his age didn't talk about fear. They talked about football or weather or crops that wouldn't grow. They drank coffee at the diner at dawn, argued about politics, then went home. But Bill lived in silence. It had been his armor for decades. Silence meant no questions, no pity, no explanations about what napalm smelled like when it clung to flesh. Silence meant survival. Yet, even silence could not drown out memory. Sometimes in the quiet of the kitchen he caught the smell of smoke, not the sharp tang of a wood stove, but the oily, suffocating burn of chemical fire. Sometimes he heard Jimmy's voice, rough and young, calling his name through the roar, and sometimes he woke drenched in sweat, his hands clawing at the sheets, still trying to pull himself out of a jungle that had burned away 50 years ago. The lump on his back throbbed. He told himself it was nothing, just the past resurfacing, a reminder that the body keeps its own secrets. But deep down, he knew better. Scars did not grow. Scars did not pulse with heat. Something was alive there. Something that had waited decades, patient and silent until now. One evening, as Helen folded sweaters by the fire, she brushed a hand over his shoulder and lingered. "It's warmer than the rest," she murmured. He said nothing. She looked at him with those eyes that had seen him through so much, eyes that once watched him limp home with bandages, still fresh, eyes that had not flinched at disfigurement. "Please, Bill, just let someone take a look." He shook his head, turning back to the fire. "I know my own damn back." But when she went to bed, he remained in the chair, staring at the flames. Fire. It had taken half his skin once. Now it seemed determined to finish what it had started. He pressed his hand against the swelling until it hurt, until he had to pull away. He whispered into the empty room, words he hadn't spoken in years. "What are you?" The house answered only with silence. The world shrank to small distances, kitchen to hallway to bathroom chair to window, and each distance felt longer than it should. The mound beneath Bill Carter's old burn throbbed with a slow, unhurried certainty, like the beat of an ocean he could not see, only feel. He learned its rhythm without trying. When he reached for the top shelf, it tugged. When he bent to tie his boot, it burned. When he tried to forget it for an hour, it sent a pared-down ache across his ribs to remind him that forgetting was not on the table. Outside, a thin glaze of ice turned the sidewalks into glass and the roads into arguments between tires and temperature. Winter in Kansas never apologized for itself, and the town respected that honesty. The diner opened on time. The post office kept to its hours. The church bell counted out the days as if the weather were only a footnote. Bill drove carefully into town, favoring the right turns, favoring the lanes with fewer surprises. He was avoiding more than ice. He was avoiding the grocery clerk who had begun to ask how he was doing with a kindness that felt too close to pity. He was avoiding the shelf with the heating pads that promised relief he did not trust. He was avoiding any mirror large enough to tell the truth. He had learned long ago to coexist with pain. The burn graphs taught him. The therapy taught him. The evenings when he could not find a position that didn't sting taught him most of all. Pain became furniture. You walk around it. But this new thing was not furniture. It was movement under the floorboards. It was the quiet pressure of something pushing its way into a room that had been closed for decades. On a Tuesday that wore the same gray as the Tuesday before, he tried to lift a bag of rock salt into the bed of the old Ford and found that his left side refused the negotiation. The ache sharpened to a point, then widened into a hot, unfamiliar circle. He set the bag down too fast and stood there with his hand on the tailgate, breath leaking out in a fog that trembled. No one was watching. The parking lot was a lacquered sheet, the kind that made men walk like dancers. He told himself to wait. He told himself the pain would contract. It did, but not back to where it had started. He drove home slower. In the living room that evening, the fireplace carried a small, obedient flame that snapped once, then settled. Helen folded sweaters at the low table by the sofa, her hands learning again the weight of wool and patience. She did not ask questions she knew he wouldn't answer. Her care had never relied on words. She placed a sweater across the back of a chair and paused. The hush between them felt like a low tide. He sat in the armchair by the window and watched the snow move sideways, the wind deciding what shape it wanted the landscape to take. He slept badly and woke worse. The house possessed its old faithful sounds, furnace, fridge, a board in the hallway with a memory of footsteps, but they did not comfort him. He stood in the shower and angled his shoulders under the spray, trying to wash the heat out of the skin that had never been right. Water beaded on the scar and ran off like rain on a tarp. When he reached to shut the tap, the movement sent a hot pulse outward and he had to steady himself against the tile. He dressed in the slow, practiced order of a man who knows which motions invite, which consequences. The shirt tugged wrong across his back. He buttoned it anyway. At the kitchen table, the coffee tasted like something from a past life familiar and oddly distant. Helen came in softly and placed a hand on his shoulder, then took it away as if the contact had told her everything she needed to know. The day arranged itself and carried them both along the way days do when they're being careful not to break. By afternoon, a wind had scraped the sky clear. The light that came through the kitchen window made clean squares on the floorboards. Bill stood with a broom in his hand, sweeping slowly as if moving dust from one place to another could count as proof of control. That was when he saw Frank Miller cutting across the front yard with the long, economical stride of a man who still trusted his knees. Frank's mutt trotted ahead, nose down, tail doing its best to negotiate between excitement and dignity. Frank did not knock the way some men didn't knock as a matter of permission already granted by years. He stamped his boots on the mat and slipped inside, pulling the door tight against the cold. "You're sweeping clean lines," he said not unkindly. His voice kept the same wry cadence he'd carried through 3 deployments, a habit of turning statement into observation. He took off his watch cap and thumped it clean against his thigh. His eyes, set, deep and bright, landed on Bill's face and stayed there a beat longer than casual conversation required. The dog made a slow circle through the kitchen, cataloging, filing away, choosing a spot by the radiator to practice the ancient art of appearing asleep while absolutely not being asleep. "Roads slick," Frank said. "Towns pretending they're not." Bill leaned the broom against the table. "They'll win. Pretending's our best sport." Frank's mouth twitched. He stepped closer, the medic in him scanning gait, color, breath. The habit was a collar he never removed. His gaze slipped casual and not to the angle of Bill's left shoulder to the way the shirt pulled tight across the back, and then released. "You sweating?" he asked, as if commenting on the weather. "House is warm," Bill said, though it wasn't. Frank nodded, once took off his gloves with a slow, deliberate patience like a man unwrapping a truth. "You know, I was in the habit of bad news, I recall." "It doesn't take 40 years for a scar to change shape," Frank said. "Not like that. Not unless something's throwing elbows underneath." The dog lifted one eye, then decided the radiator was more compelling. "I know my own back." Bill said the sentence that had become a shelter and a maze. "Sure," Frank said. He didn't step closer, didn't crowd the moment. Sometimes the house you know hides the leak that ruins the floor. He let the silence stand up between them, each man measuring it by different rules. "There's a clinic between the pharmacy and the dry cleaner. Dr. Rhodes. She minds her nouns, doesn't waste the verbs. She won't make you feel small." Bill's hands closed and opened. The skin across the knuckles looked older this winter. In the doorway to the hall, he could feel the furnace blow the briefest ribbon of heat past his ankles, then lose interest. He could hear Helen moving quietly in the back bedroom, the sound of drawers making their agreements. He did not look at Frank. He looked at the broom instead. The bristles, splayed by years of sweeping, had adapted. They still did their job. Frank put his cap back on. He whistled to the dog, who obliged without complaint. At the door he paused and looked back over his shoulder. His voice rehung itself on a lower peg. "You're a lot of things, Bill. Ghost isn't one of them." Then he stepped into the cold and closed the door without letting the house lose its heat. The words didn't give an order. They offered a direction. There is a difference. That night, the ache turned meaner. He reached up to a high shelf for a jar that had likely been empty for months and felt a blade of heat slice down his side and settle. He let the jar be. He pressed a hand to the place and found it warmer than the rest of him. He went to the mirror he trusted least and craned awkwardly to catch the edge of what he didn't want to see. The swelling had darkened at the center, color pulled like a bruise from a place deeper than skin. The edges were less polite than before. The mound looked less like a mistake and more like a decision. Sleep did not arrive, only truce. When he drifted onto a road he knew intimately, a strip of laterite dirt that tried to pretend it was a road because men had decided it should be. The air in the dream had the same heavy sweetness it always had, the jungle's green turned metallic by heat. His boots sucked at the mud with every step. A radio hissed with the particular anger of distance. Somewhere a bird called in a pattern that felt like a warning the body understood before the mind caught up. He did not see the plane first. He felt the split in the air, the unnatural quiver in the leaves, and then the sound dropped less a sound than a weight. When the napalm bloomed, it bloomed in slow motion the way disaster does when the body is waiting for its orders. He watched orange ribbons curl and thicken and then unroll over everything that thought it had a right to exist. Heat ceased to be a temperature and became a language. It spoke directly to the nerves, to the parts of him that would always remember. In the dream, as always, he saw Jimmy Doyle's silhouette tear free from one geometry of fire and enter another. The figure lean the movement insistently human against a field that had decided otherwise. He remembered the grip on his shoulder, the stubborn drag of a friend who chose to ignore physics for a moment longer than physics would allow. He remembered the second canister. He remembered the way time knelt down and then refused to get up. He remembered waking on a mat of dirt that had not cooled. He sat up in a dark Kansas room and waited for the sound of his own name to stop echoing from a jungle that no longer existed, except in certain men's blood. The clock on the dresser accepted the hour without judgment. In the next room, the refrigerator performed its old, humble miracle. He pressed his fingers against the raised, fevered hill below his shoulder blade and exhaled carefully as if too much air might feed a flame. Morning came like surrender. Helen moved quietly through the kitchen, relighting the day as if it required kindling. She set a cup by his hand. Steam climbed in patient spirals. He tried to say what needed to be said and found that the words came out strange without a uniform around them. "Maybe I'll have someone take a look," he said. Not to the cup, not to the window, not to the soft ridged scar he'd worn for most of his life, but to the room that had kept him alive all these years. Helen did not make relief into celebration. She gave him a look that held exactly enough gratitude to make the moment shareable, then turned to the phone with the dignity of a woman who had waited long enough. The clinic's receptionist had that bright tone offices cultivate against the weather. An appointment opened and was filled. The time was penciled across the corner of a calendar that still held last year's Christmas magnet. Bill watched the day carry him toward its center. The drive to the clinic passed through neighborhoods that had learned the same lesson about winter. Narrow your ambitions, wait for a better light. He watched the bare trees line up like a row of patient men and remembered how branches had looked when a different fire had asked them what they were made of. He did not speak. Helen didn't ask him to. The quiet in the cab was clean, and he respected the cleanliness of it. The clinic sat between the pharmacy and the dry cleaner exactly where Frank had said it would. Exactly where anything determined to be ordinary would choose to be. The beige facade wore winter like a sweater and didn't try to pretend it was handsome. Inside, the heat startled him. A ficus had found a way to live by the window, and a framed print of wildflowers did its best to be spring. The woman at the desk slid a clipboard through the small opening reserved for exchange. Forms ask the questions. Forms have always asked, crafted to corral the complexity of a life into small rectangles where ink could claim victory. He wrote his name carefully and left the rest to memory and approximation. They called him by his last name with a civility that acknowledged there had been a first name once and would be again. The exam room smelled clean in the way that always pitched him back to a ward outside Tokyo to the summer of gauze and the fever of repair. He sat on the paper-covered table that crackled when he breathed too much. The poster of skin layers did not try to be art. He felt the old muscle of impatience flex and was surprised to find that he could ask it to sit, Doctor. Emily Rhodes entered with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned the shape of fear and decided not to take it personally. She was younger than the surgeons who had once cut him and older than the students who trailed them. She looked directly at him and then at the page in her hand, and somehow both looks held the same weight. She introduced herself and did not turn her name into a shield. Her questions were precise. History, injury treatments, graphs, any changes. He answered in the economy he favored, allowing words to be currency again after so many years of austerity. "May I take a look?" she asked, and the "may" carried respect rather than permission as formality. He unbuttoned his shirt with the gracelessness of a man unbuttoning a decade and let the fabric fall. The air against his back felt both colder and warmer than it should have. He saw her face only in profile as she stepped behind him, the medical gaze reorganizing his history into present tense. Her fingers pressed gently around the swelling. She did not flinch, but he could hear the subtle intake of breath, the sound professional people make when their concern is refusing to stay seated. "Has it changed color recently?" Her voice was factual, not unkind. He found the words. Darker. Warmer. It throbs. She nodded, the small nod of thought reshaping itself. "Any discharge. Number pain at rest, yes," he said, and he was surprised to discover that the truth came quicker when there was someone in the room trained to receive it. She moved to face him again, eyes meeting his with a directness that did not ask for anything extra. "I'd like to order a biopsy," she said, and the sentence balanced carefully on a narrow ledge between information and alarm. "Given your history of deep chemical burns, we need to rule out a malignancy that can develop within old scar tissue. It's rare, but it happens. Words are furniture too, but some of them open doors when you set them down." He didn't ask which malignancy. The shape of the word that would come later hovered just beyond the horizon of the conversation. He nodded, because nodding was the cleanest way to keep moving. "All right," he said, and something in him added finally. The logistics arranged themselves the way logistics do when a system knows its job. A nurse explained a small tray of instruments with the quiet respect of someone who knew every object on it could be a bridge if used correctly. Appointments populated a calendar. Forms accepted signatures. Helen listened to the instructions with a stillness that radiated competence. Bill let the steps lift him one after the other across a narrow stream he would rather not have seen. Back home, the late afternoon had sharpened into a cold that knew exactly what it was doing. The sky went pale, and then paler still. Bill sat on the edge of the bed and unbuttoned his shirt again, an action that now felt like a ritual without a church. He looked not at the mirror, but at his hands. The knuckles were a map he could still read. Scars, freckles, the slight tremor that winter magnified. He thought about Frank's sentence, "Ghost isn't one of them," and found he could stand to hear it again. He thought of Dr. Rhodes's deliberate language, the way she let the word rare belong to science and not to him. He thought of Helen's small nod at the clinic door, a promise that had survived so many versions of him. When sleep came, it came with edges. He drifted to the printed jungle, then back to the room with the window that faced the field. In that in-between place, memory is less a movie than a smell. Napalm didn't smell like wood or coal or anything human. It smelled like a decision made by a far-off mind that had never intended to meet the bodies it would change. In the edge-light of that thought, Jimmy Doyle's face arrived the version of his friend he always saw in the dreams, grinning in the awful way young men grin because they are not yet willing to believe how close they are to becoming memory. In the dream, as always, Jimmy reached for him, and in the dream, as always, Bill's hand closed around air that had already moved. He woke knowing two things. The first was that the biopsy would not return the luxury of ignorance. The second was that he could not continue the old contract with silence. He got up and walked to the kitchen where the house had kept a place for him among its dependable noises. He set a notebook on the table and opened it to a clean page. The paper smelled faintly of dust and wood, the way all potential smells. He wrote his name as if he were reintroducing himself to a room he had just entered. He did not write about cancer. He wrote about a road east of Quang Tri that will always be there whether maps remember it or not. He wrote about fire the way a man writes about weather that has learned to speak. He wrote about how bodies carry embers and how some embers learn patience better than men do. The words did not fix anything. They only turned a small light on. He stopped when his hand began to ache in a familiar pattern and set the pen down. The house had darkened without asking permission. He listened for the sound of Helen moving in the next room and found it. He sat with the quiet until it grew a shape he recognized. There is a kind of peace that is not a promise, only an absence of argument. For now, that was enough. Tia. If you're listening because a story like this belongs to you in ways you haven't said out loud, stay with us. These true healing journeys are how some of us keep going and how others find the courage to start. If you'd like more stories that meet you where it hurts and walk with you toward the light, consider subscribing to our channel so you won't miss what's next. The days between the biopsy and the call were not really days. They were fragments strung together by habit coffee, poured blinds opened, driveway salted. Yet beneath each act lay a silence that threatened to rupture. Waiting has a sound. It is the tick of the clock that stretches too long between seconds, the small creaks of the house announcing itself to fill the void, the hum of the refrigerator that feels like a companion, because it does not leave. Bill Carter listened to all of it and gave none of it a reply. The wound on his back was tender bandaged neatly by the nurse who had spoken with practiced calm. A small square of gauze taped down like a secret carried more weight than he could bear to name. He carried himself carefully through the rooms as though sudden movement might disturb not just flesh but time itself. He found excuses to keep busy small chores to convince himself he was not simply pacing the perimeter of his own dread. He oiled the hinges on the garage door, replaced a light bulb in the hallway, swept the porch, though no one would visit in this weather. But dread does not care about busyness. It only waits, and it always wins. On the fifth morning, the phone rang. The sound startled him enough that the screwdriver slipped from his hand and clattered onto the workbench. Helen was already reaching for the receiver. He stood in the garage doorway, unable to cross into the kitchen where the conversation would take place. He watched her face as she listened. She nodded once, her expression unreadable, then thanked the caller. When she hung up, she didn't look at him right away. She sat down slowly at the table, her hand resting on the wood as if steadying herself. "They want us to come in tomorrow," she said at last. "Not today, tomorrow, a single day. But it might as well have been a lifetime." The clinic was beige and ordinary, the kind of building designed to be overlooked. Yet stepping through its doors felt like entering a place where everything in his life had gathered for judgment. Helen's hand brushed his as they walked across the parking lot, the kind of contact that spoke louder than words. He did not pull away. Inside, they waited in chairs that had lost their softness long ago. The magazines on the table were years out of date, their colors faded by countless hands. Bill did not read. He stared at the floor until his name was called. Dr. Emily Rhodes greeted them with her usual calm. She gestured toward her office rather than the exam room, a small mercy. A file lay on her desk, closed its thickness, promising more than anyone wanted to know. She folded her hands atop it and looked directly at him. "Mr. Carter," she began, "thank you for coming in." Her voice carried a weight that left no room for avoidance. "We have the biopsy results back." He braced himself. Helen's fingers tightened around his, her knuckles pale. "The tissue shows signs of squamous cell carcinoma," Dr. Rhodes continued. "Specifically, it's what we call a Marjolin's ulcer. It's a rare but aggressive form of cancer that can develop within old burn scars. Given your history of chemical burns, this is not entirely unexpected." The words fell like ash, soft but suffocating. Marjolin's ulcer. He had never heard the name before, but it sounded ancient, almost medieval, like a curse handed down through centuries. He let the words settle, feeling them find a place beside the names that had haunted him for decades. Napalm, Quang Tri Doyle. Helen spoke first. "What does that mean for him?" Dr. Rhodes opened the file, revealing diagrams and notes in neat handwriting. "The good news is that it appears localized for now, but the margins aren't clear, which means it is trying to spread. We'll need to act quickly. The recommended course is surgical excision, removing the scar tissue and a margin of healthy skin around it. Depending on the depth, we may need to perform a skin graft." "Will it come back?" Bill asked. His voice surprised him, steady, almost detached. "If we remove it all and monitor closely, the prognosis is good," she said, then paused. "But Marjolin's ulcers are aggressive. Regular follow-ups will be critical." Silence expanded between them, filled only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. Bill stared at the floor, tracing invisible lines across the sterile tiles. He felt Helen's hand still holding his, grounding him, but his mind was already drifting. In his memory, the jungle stirred again. It was March of 1972. The air had been thick-heavy with a silence that warned more than comforted. His unit had set up near a burned-out village, the remnants of homes turned to skeletons by war. Jimmy Doyle sat across from him, sharpening his knife, that familiar grin tugging at his mouth. "You think we'll get pulled out soon?" Jimmy had asked. Bill had shrugged. "If we're lucky." Jimmy had leaned back, smoke curling from the cigarette between his fingers. "Not out here," he'd said. Then, after a pause, "When we get home, I'll take you for the best barbecue in Memphis. Ribs that'll make you forget this jungle ever existed." The memory played like a record, the needle dragging toward the part he dreaded. The roar of planes, the sudden split of the sky, the bloom of napalm unfurling like a monstrous flower. Fire that stuck to everything, that turned men into living torches. Jimmy's hand grabbing his shoulder, dragging him through a world that no longer wanted them alive. And then the explosion. The shockwave Jimmy lifted into the air. When Bill crawled to him, his eyes were open but unseeing. He had carried that moment for decades. And now, sitting in a beige office in Kansas, hearing the word cancer, he felt the fire had finally caught up to him. Back home, the house felt heavier, as if the diagnosis had soaked into the walls. Helen moved softly around him, cooking meals he didn't touch, folding laundry he barely noticed. He sat at the kitchen table long after the coffee went cold, staring at the shadows crawling across the floor. That night, he opened his notebook again. His handwriting sprawled unevenly across the page, but he didn't care. He wrote about Jimmy, the way he laughed, the way he always saved the last cigarette for someone else, the way he had dragged Bill through fire until there was nothing left to give. He wrote about survivor's guilt, about how it lived inside him like another scar one no surgeon could cut out. "If I let this take me," he wrote, "maybe it will be fair." Jimmy didn't get to grow old. Why should I? He closed the notebook and left it on the chair beside him. When Helen found it the next morning, she didn't say anything. She simply held it in her hands for a long time, her fingers trembling over the cover. The swelling on his back pulsed harder each day, a relentless reminder. The pain sharpened, sending jolts down his side when he reached too far or turned too quickly. At night, lying awake beside Helen, he listened to her breathing steady, patient, the sound of a life lived in loyalty, and he wondered how many nights were left. He wanted to tell Michael, their son, but the words wouldn't come. Michael had grown up with distance between them, a gap carved by silence and the refusal to burden a child with war. Bill had always thought he was protecting him. Now it felt like a lie. Helen urged him gently. "You need to let him in, Bill." But he shook his head. He doesn't need to carry this. Yet, even as he said it, he knew the weight was too heavy to bear alone. One evening, while the wind rattled the windows and snow pressed against the porch, he sat in the darkened living room, his fingers tracing the raised mound on his back. He whispered to the empty room, to Jimmy, to the fire that had never left. "Is this the justice I've been waiting for?" No answer came. Only silence. Only the slow, insistent throb beneath his skin. And for the first time in decades, Bill Carter felt truly afraid. The house carried its weight like an old body, each board and hinge aware of its history. Bill Carter moved through it as if through a museum of his own silence. The kitchen table, the porch swing, the garage bench, each place bore witness to years of him keeping words locked inside, years of Helen translating the unsaid. But after the diagnosis, silence shifted. It was no longer armor, it was confinement. He woke before dawn, listening to the tick of the clock on the dresser, the whisper of Helen's breathing beside him. The pain in his back throbbed like an uninvited drummer keeping time with his heartbeat. He sat up carefully, pulled on his robe, and walked to the kitchen. The notebook was there, waiting, a simple lined pad with a cover scuffed by his hands. He opened it and began to write again. Not about the tumor, not about the appointment, but about Jimmy Doyle. About fire blooming in the sky, about the smell that never left his memory, about the sound of a friend's voice cutting through the roar of planes. Words spilled where they had never been allowed. He wrote of guilt, like a weight tied to his ribs dragging him down every time he tried to stand tall. He wrote of fear that pretended to be anger, of nights when Helen held his hand until sleep finally pulled him under. And then, almost without realizing, he wrote the sentence he had been circling for weeks. Maybe I shouldn't fight this. Maybe it would be fair to let it take me. When he closed the notebook, his hands trembled. He left it on the armrest of the chair, as if daring fate to see it. Helen found it that afternoon. She had been folding laundry again, the rhythm of cloth a comfort in uncertain days. When she lifted the last shirt from the basket, she noticed the notebook sitting open, Bill's handwriting covering the page in uneven strokes. She froze, reading the words that cut deeper than any wound, his confession of surrender, his thought of evening the score with death. She stood in the doorway, the notebook in her hands, her chest tight with the kind of ache that comes from recognition, not surprise. She walked slowly to the living room where Bill sat with the television-muted shadows crawling across his face. She held the notebook out not as an accusation, but as a question. "Is this what you've been thinking?" He didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the muted screen, though he wasn't watching. She sat beside him, the notebook still on her lap. "You think dying would even the score? You think letting this take you would somehow make up for what happened to Jimmy?" Her voice was soft but steady. It carried none of the hysteria he half expected, none of the anger. It was worse than that. It was love refusing to let him vanish. Bill swallowed hard. Maybe. He didn't get to grow old. Why should I? Helen's eyes shimmered, but she did not cry. "Do you know what I remember most about when you came back from Tokyo?" He turned his head slowly, finally meeting her gaze. "You could barely walk. Your skin was still wrapped in gauze, but you made it all the way to my porch carrying a bouquet of flowers you'd bought at the bus station. They were dying, Bill. Half the petals were brown, but you handed them to me like they were the only proof you had that life could still be beautiful. And then you cried. You didn't say a word, but you cried." He blinked, the memory flickering faintly in his mind. "I don't remember that." "I do," she whispered. "I remember everything. I remember the way you couldn't sit through fireworks on the 4th of July. I remember how you woke up gasping in the middle of the night. But I also remember how you laughed again. I remember you teaching Michael to ride his bike. I remember you fixing the neighbor's roof in a storm. I remember you humming Johnny Cash songs on the porch like they were hymns. You've spent decades living, Bill. Living for me, for our son, for yourself, even when you didn't realize it." Her hand reached for his, pressing gently against his scarred knuckles. "And do you really think Jimmy would want you to throw that away? Do you really think his sacrifice meant you should stop living the moment it got hard again?" The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. It was silence, breaking, not protecting. That night, Bill couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the echoes of Helen's words chasing him through the dark. For the first time, the guilt felt less like a chain and more like a weight he could set down, even if only briefly. And then, unbidden, Jimmy's voice came to him not in the roar of fire, but in the quiet of memory. "If you make it out, live, like it means something." The sentence repeated softer each time until it felt like prayer. By morning, Bill made his choice. Over breakfast, he pushed aside the untouched toast and looked at Helen. "I'll do the surgery," he said quietly. "I'll fight." She nodded, her eyes bright but composed. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. No words of triumph, no declarations. Just a steady promise she would be there. The days leading up to the surgery were marked by a strange combination of dread and clarity. Bill found himself noticing the small things, how the light shifted across the living room floor at different hours, how Helen hummed when she was measuring flour, how the old truck coughed on cold mornings, but always started anyway. He walked slowly around the block, the winter air burning his lungs, each step a reminder that his body still belonged to him, at least for now. At night, he wrote again, but the words had changed. They were not confessions of surrender anymore, but fragments of memory he wanted preserved. He wrote about Jimmy's grin about the way Memphis ribs had become a dream shared in the middle of a jungle. He wrote about Michael as a boy standing in a Little League uniform too big for him. He wrote about Helen, the quiet strength that had carried him through decades. He left the notebook open on the table, and when Helen found it, she smiled through tears. Chapter 20. The morning of the pre-op appointment, Frank Miller stopped by. He stood on the porch with his dog hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. "Heard you're going in," he said, his tone neutral, but his eyes warm. Bill nodded. Frank tilted his head. "Took you long enough." For the first time in months, Bill let out a laugh, short, rough, but real. Frank grinned and handed him a six-pack of soda. "You'll need it after the hospital food." It wasn't camaraderie forged in words, but in recognition. They were men who understood survival in silence. As the surgery date drew near, Bill felt both fear and a strange sense of peace. Fear of the scalpel, of what they might find, of whether his body could endure another assault after all these years. But peace, too, because he had chosen not to surrender, because he was no longer pretending he was fine when he wasn't. Because silence had finally broken. On the night before, he sat on the porch with Helen wrapped in an old quilt. The stars scattered above them, sharp against the black sky. The winter wind cut cold, but he hardly noticed. "Thank you for staying," he whispered. "I was always going to," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. And for the first time in decades, Bill Carter felt like he wasn't carrying the fire alone. Tinto, if this story is reaching you, if you know what it's like to carry something heavy in silence, remember, you don't have to. And if you'd like to walk with us through more journeys like this one, subscribe to our channel. These stories matter, and sometimes they're the light we need when the night feels endless. The morning of the surgery arrived, wrapped in frost. The hospital loomed against the gray Kansas sky, a building without ornament designed for function and not comfort. Yet inside, corridors hummed with life, the shuffle of nurses' shoes, the rhythmic beeps of monitors, the hushed voices of families gathered in waiting rooms. Bill Carter walked through it all like a man stepping into a river, knowing he would not emerge unchanged. Helen held his arm as they checked in, her grip steady, though he could feel the tremor beneath it. Her presence was both anchor and reminder he was not fighting alone. Still, as the orderly wheeled him toward pre-op, he felt the isolation of the moment descend. No one could share what awaited under the bright lights and steel instruments. Dr. Emily Rhodes appeared at his bedside, her mask pulled down for now, her eyes clear and direct. "We'll take good care of you, Mr. Carter," she said. "The goal is complete removal of the malignant tissue. We may need to graft skin depending on how deep it runs, but you're strong and you're ready." He nodded. Words were difficult. He had spent decades hiding from the fire of his past. Now he was willingly stepping back into it. As they rolled him toward the operating room, a memory-surged jungle heat pressing down like a second skin, the roar of planes above Jimmy Doyle's voice calling his name. But this time the fire came not from war, but from healing hands. The operating room was a theater of precision. Bright lights washed out shadow stainless steel, gleamed masked faces moved with choreographed efficiency. Bill felt the cool sting of antiseptic on his skin, the gentle press of electrodes, the steady rhythm of his own heart captured by machines. "Count backward from 10, the anesthesiologist instructed. 10, 9, 8. By 7, the fire was gone. When he woke hours later, the world was dim and heavy. Pain radiated from his back, dulled but insistent. His throat was dry, his mouth tasted of metal. Slowly, the sterile ceiling came into focus. A voice. Helen's floated nearby, soft but certain. "You're here, Bill. You made it through." He turned his head, saw her face etched with exhaustion yet glowing with relief. He tried to speak, but only managed a rasp. She pressed a straw to his lips, and he sipped cool water that felt like grace itself. Dr. Rhodes entered, her eyes above the mask crinkling with a small smile. "The surgery went well. We removed the ulcer and surrounding scar tissue. Margins look clear, but we'll confirm with pathology. We performed a graft. Your skin will need time to heal, but it's clean, Bill. You gave us what we needed to work with." Her words sank in slowly. Clean, clear, words he had not expected to hear. Teat. Recovery was not easy. Pain lingered sharp and demanding. Nurses adjusted bandages, checked drains, encouraged him to walk the halls, even when each step felt like a battle. He caught his reflection in a hallway window once a man stooped, moving carefully, his hospital gown fluttering awkwardly. Yet, behind the weakness, he noticed something unfamiliar. Not just survival, not just endurance, something closer to defiance. Helen visited each day, her presence quiet but unwavering. She brought books he didn't read, photographs he couldn't yet bear to look at. What mattered was her hand in his, the anchor that kept him from drifting too far into despair. One evening, as dusk spilled across the ward, another visitor arrived. Michael Carter, tall, his hair flecked with gray at the temples, his eyes carrying both distance and concern. He stood at the doorway, uncertain, as though unsure if he was welcome. Bill shifted in the bed, his voice rough. "Didn't expect to see you here." Michael hesitated, then stepped inside. Mom called. She said it was time. For a long moment they looked at each other across the sterile space, father and son divided by years of silence. Finally, Michael pulled a chair closer and sat down. His voice softened. "She said you weren't telling me everything, that you never have." Bill's eyes fell to the blanket covering his legs. He swallowed, then forced himself to speak. "I didn't want you to carry it. The war, the scars, the nightmares. I thought I was protecting you." Michael's brow furrowed. By shutting me out, Bill's throat tightened. He had no defense, only truth. I didn't know how else to survive. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't the old silence. It was fragile, yes, but also a space waiting to be filled. Michael leaned forward, his voice low. "I didn't need you to be perfect. I just needed you to be real, even broken, especially broken." The words struck deeper than any scalpel. Bill closed his eyes, and for the first time in decades he let the tears come, not silent tears hidden in the dark, but open ones falling where his son could see. Michael reached across the bed rail, took his hand, and held it firmly. It was not forgiveness spoken aloud. It was something greater, a bridge rebuilt. The following days carried new rhythm. Short walks down the corridor, physical therapy exercises, nurses teaching Helen how to change dressings. Each small act became evidence of progress, proof that the fire could be cut away and life could grow in its place. At night, when the ward grew quiet, Bill dreamed differently. Not of napalm skies or burning villages, but of Jimmy Doyle, smiling across a campfire, smoke curling into the night. In the dream, Jimmy raised a hand not to drag him forward, but to wave goodbye. Bill woke with tears drying on his face, and for once they were not heavy with guilt. 2 weeks later, he returned home. The house smelled of wood smoke, the garden still hidden under winter's frost. But stepping onto the porch, feeling the cold air rush his lungs, Bill knew he had crossed a threshold. The scar was still there, reshaped, stitched, healing. But the weight it carried was lighter. He was not free of the past, not entirely. He never would be. But he was no longer alone in carrying it. Helen knew, Michael now knew, and somehow Jimmy too, wherever he was, had finally let go. That night, sitting with Helen by the fire, Bill spoke words he had not said in years. "I think I want to live, not just survive. Live." Helen smiled, her hand finding his. "Then let's start again," and the silence that once protected him shattered into something new. Connection fragile, but real. Petite. If this story has touched you, if you've ever carried scars that no one else could see, remember, you're not alone. Healing is possible even when the fire feels endless. Subscribe to our channel to walk with us through more journeys like this, because stories like these can be the light we didn't know we needed. Spring came late that year. Snow melted reluctantly, clinging to the corners of rooftops and the edges of fields, as if winter feared being forgotten. For Bill, Carter recovery was measured not in seasons, but in steps, each one slow, each one deliberate, each one proof that life still had room for him. The graft healed with stubborn patience, skin knitting over what had once been a battlefield. He winced at times when reaching too far, but pain no longer felt like punishment. It was reminder evidence that he was alive, and after decades of drifting through silence, being alive had begun to feel like enough. Michael visited more often now, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with nothing but time. They would sit on the porch together, the old swing creaking under their weight. Words came slowly, like men unlearning habits built over years, but they came. Michael asked questions about the war questions Bill had long kept locked behind the scar, and Bill answered not every detail, not every horror, but enough. Enough for Michael to know that silence had never meant absence. One evening, Michael brought his own son, a boy with quick eyes and restless feet. The child climbed onto Bill's lap without hesitation, pressing small hands against the scar that lay hidden beneath his shirt. "Grandpa," he asked, "did it hurt?" Bill smiled gently. "Yes, but I healed." The boy nodded, satisfied with an answer simple enough for his world. For Bill, it was more than explanation. It was testimony. Helen remained his compass. She watched over him with the quiet vigilance as she had always carried, but now it was different, not the worry of a wife afraid to lose, but the love of a partner ready to begin again. Together they tended the small garden behind the house. Rows of tomatoes and beans pushed up through the thawed earth, fragile but determined. Bill found peace in the soil, his hands digging where once they had only clenched. At night, he and Helen read aloud from the newspaper, her voice filling the room with steady rhythm. Sometimes he would hum Johnny Cash under his breath, and she would laugh, shaking her head. These small rituals, once overlooked, became treasures. They were the daily proof that the fire had not consumed everything. Yet the past never vanished. Memories returned softer now, but still insistent. Bill still dreamed of Jimmy Doyle, though the nightmares had shifted. No longer did he see him torn by flame. Instead, he saw him standing at the edge of a field, waving his grin wide, his hand lifted not in warning, but in farewell. Bill would wake with tears on his cheeks, but they were different tears, tears of gratitude. He began to write again. Not confessions of guilt, not lists of fears, but stories. He filled pages with fragments of memory, weaving together pieces of war and home sorrow and survival. Helen encouraged him to share them with Michael, and one afternoon he did. He sat with his son at the kitchen table, sliding the worn notebook across the wood. Michael read silently, his eyes lingering, his throat tightening. When he finished, he looked up. "Dad, these aren't just your stories. They're ours too." The words settled deep inside Bill, filling a space long hollowed by silence. As months passed, the scar faded from raw red to pale silver, a mark that no longer demanded shame. Bill sometimes caught his reflection in the mirror, the seam across his back visible like a line of history. But instead of turning away, he would stand a moment longer, acknowledging it. The scar no longer meant only fire. It meant survival. It meant second chances. One summer evening, as twilight stretched long across the fields, Bill gathered Helen and Michael on the porch. He spoke softly, his voice steady. "I used to think this scar was punishment," he said, "a reminder that I didn't deserve to live when Jimmy didn't. But now I see it's something else. It's proof that I carried fire and came through it. Proof that life gives us chances even when we don't believe we deserve them." Helen reached for his hand. Michael nodded, eyes wet but proud. And in that moment, Bill felt lighter than he had in half a century. He would never be the man he was before the jungle. He would never be without memories of fire. But he was no longer defined by them. He was a husband, still loved. A father still needed a grandfather whose scars became stories rather than secrets. And on nights when stars scattered sharp against the black sky, Bill Carter would step outside, breathe deep and whisper into the silence, not with fear, but with gratitude. I'm still here. Thank you for walking through this story with us. If you've ever carried scars visible or hidden, know this healing is possible. Scars can become stories, and stories can light the way for others. Subscribe to our channel to join more journeys like this one. Together, we keep the light alive.